welcome back to the Kingsway Podcast.
Welcome.
Thanks so much for tuning in. Got a fun one for you today. It's been a little while since we've done kind of one outside of our church values
Or
and
some
the
other
chosen,
series.
some of that stuff. And so we are mixing it up this week, and we have a special guest. What's up, Tyler?
Hello.
This is my brother from the same mother.
Same mother.
Yeah.
And Tyler's in town, and I couldn't resist. And Ryan, you were with me. We couldn't resist. Inviting him onto the podcast to point out that we still have things to learn. Right?
Yeah. That's it.
That's it.
I definitely, based on the visuals here, which you can see on the Spotify and Apple Music version of this
Totally
podcast,
can.
you can see it in even greater clarity. I have the facial hair growing skill
Yes.
to learn.
Uh-huh.
I'm trying really hard.
Dude, he's a professional, and it's going to take you time to get to his level.
I'm at the apprentice stage.
Just trying to look the least threatening as possible while driving a nondescript van around New York City.
You
so
know,
that's part of it.
you may not be in the right vein, the right vein of what that needs to look like. But all jokes aside, not completely though, because we'll have some more fun here in a minute.
Some jokes included.
Today we're going to do kind of a segment that we've done before, but we like to come back to it every now and then because I do think that learning takes effort, it takes intentionality, and a lot of times it takes stretching yourself beyond some of the normal avenues that you kind of stick to, that you're comfortable with, and that includes books, movies, podcasts, some of that stuff. And so knowing that Ryan and I spending enough time together, you and I have had enough discussions where you're like, have you read this? And I'm like, no.
Yeah.
And I'm like, have you read this? And you're like, probably, but no, no, sometimes. Tyler is actually a proficient reader. He likes studying, likes doing things. Now you did have a child in the last year and a half, and so that may have put a little bit of a kink in that at times to time. But you also have gone back to school a little bit, so you've been forced to read some new things too. And so I think it's a fun conversation, I think, today, just to go, hey, what are you reading? What are you learning? What are some things that are inspiring you? What are some things that are entertaining you that are worth looking into and fun? Because I know that's part of the summer. It's looking into some of that. And then music. Sometimes music is just, I don't know, it's a quick way to kind of engage emotions, engage cool thoughts. And I think at times music goes to the fastest, deepest places of my soul, almost anything else. So that being said, not trying to make it too serious. We can still have fun and say silly things. But I think this conversation is going to be great. So we're going to frame it a couple different ways. Obviously, Tyler had lots of time to prepare, and in that 20 minutes before he got here,
he had minutes on minutes.
Dozens of minutes.
Literally dozens. To prepare for this podcast. But I don't want to put him completely on the spot. So therefore, Ryan, who had even less time to prepare.
Oh, I'm good.
And so he's going to be first. Let's just go with this. What has been your favorite book that you've read? Not necessarily the one that you're recommending yet, but the one that you've just found most entertaining, most fun, most worth reading in the last, let's say 4 to 6 months.
Okay, last 4 to 6 months. That pares down everything I had in person today.
Well,
because I'm still reading it.
Yeah, no, that's okay. And you can still be reading that, or whatever you're going to recommend.
The book that I think is probably my favorite out of the past 4 or 6 months is Phil Vischer's autobiographical book called Me, Myself, and Bob. Phil Vischer's the creator of VeggieTales. I've said that about every podcast for 20 or so.
Well, you've been listening to this podcast a lot.
Yeah, I can't stop. But it's such a good autobiographical book because partly for me, because I've listened to him for 283 episodes so far, and they're all an hour.
Goodness.
And so just hearing his voice and his quirks come through this book and the amount of detail he pours into it. And it's stuff that if anybody else was writing it, it would be boring.
Yep.
But he's writing it, so it's hysterical.
Does he? So you're not doing the audiobook?
No.
Because he probably read it. So it would even be...
I don't know that he has an audiobook because on an episode in 2017, he said that he can't get the rights to do the audiobook. Otherwise, he would do it.
Oh, that's so sad.
Yeah.
So
call your senator from your state. This is a crisis moment.
I'm not sure if a well-placed tweet isn't more influential these days.
Yeah, you might be right.
What does it cover? His story doing VeggieTales,
So
or then transition?
So
to
it covers his
now?
story pretty much from the very beginning, from like birth and whatever, through him starting, running VeggieTales, all the way through it going bankrupt and him having to sell it in like 2006 or maybe earlier.
Wow.
And then it has like 2 or 3 chapters at the end about dreams and our Christian faith and how and this is like when people hire him to speak somewhere, this is his stock speech, is basically the end of his book, which is that the way we think about dreams isn't biblical. That saying, I feel like I like baseball and I'm good at baseball. My dream is to be a baseball player. He's like, that's not biblical. That's, yeah.
Yeah.
And if you want to hear more about that.
when you say dreams, you mean not like when you sleep at night,
like
but like the hopes you have.
He pulls out Webster, one of those, and has 4 definitions of dream. And one is like the thing you see at night. And one is, I don't know, anyway. But what he's talking about are like aspirations. And when you phrase it that way, it's like that seems very personal and not necessarily from God.
Yeah.
Automatically.
So I love that recommendation. I think that would be one that most of our listeners at least know what VeggieTales is.
Yeah.
And by that I mean our moms. And but also I think sorry, it's a silly joke, but it's true. I love you, Mom. Also, I think that it's just a fun way that I think the audience, if you grew up hearing about VeggieTales or you have a little bit of nostalgia, hearing the heart behind it. And Phil Vischer, I think, is a great person to kind of get to know, like, even what he created and how much impact it has. He would go back and do things a little differently if he could now, and what he did. So that's fantastic. Tyler, we're going to get to you in just a second. I do want to preface this that, yes, we are brothers. Yes, he is younger, even though he looks older and wiser.
You don't look older.
You don't?
Just wiser.
Just wiser.
Yes, I look younger and wiser.
Actually, the older I get, I feel older than you a lot. I looked at the pictures from yesterday, and my beard has about 10 times as much gray as yours does. And I was like, well, great. Oops. But you live in New York City, Brooklyn. And with your wife and your young daughter, and you've been there through the whole pandemic, which is most of it, which has been, I'm sure, plain madness. And so coming off of that too, like, I think some of the recommendations and some of the things you're thinking about, I just want to make sure that that's a perspective that's very different from where we're recording in our little like Shire at times moments.
Of very rural Missouri.
Very rural.
Let me back up. Very rural for somebody from St. Louis,
Missouri.
Missouri. Yeah, Joplin seemed
from the
rural.
place from the guy that graduated from Chandler High School who had more students than there's people in this town.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's very rural. So that being said, I want to preface that as just like your recommendations and what you're reading. I'm curious because, again, that's perspective. You know what you're looking for, what you're wanting, and obviously as an individual and personality, that's different too. But that also has a deep impact, I think, on what you read. So, what are your thoughts of the last 4 to 6 months? What have you been reading? What's been? And this is a recommendation. This is just you saying this is what I've enjoyed.
Me personally, that I've enjoyed. I'm not at a lack of recommendations or books.
I know you're not.
It's more of like which ones come to mind at this moment, and some of it is moving to the next book. It's a problem. I have a problem. I think I can say I'm addicted to reading the next thing. And, so that's I'll just put that out there. But I guess right now I'm thinking about. I was looking over. I keep a list of things that I've read over the course of the year, and what jumped out to me when I was just looking back over it was the Autobiography of Malcolm X, which it's the Autobiography of Malcolm X as told to Alex Haley, because Malcolm X was actually assassinated before he was working on it. He was assassinated, and then somebody else actually sort of compiled and finished it for him.
Wow.
It's interesting for a couple reasons. One, because Malcolm X is somebody who we hear a lot about. I know I heard a lot about through movies or through sort of imitations on like variety shows, or he's just referenced to. You only hear like a clip every now and then, or maybe you've just seen. There's a real famous picture of him with like a rifle, like looking out his window.
Okay.
So that's one of the reasons I wanted to learn about him. He grew up and spent a lot of time in Harlem, up in New York. So kind of where I am. Yeah. He organized actually one of the biggest protests of segregated schools, and actually is in New York City.
Wow.
So it's
history of your town too. That's
yeah,
what I'm saying. Mm-hmm.
This is this place. So I actually listened to the audiobook version read by Lawrence Fishburne.
Yeah.
So it's like listening to Malcolm X's words while being read to by Morpheus. This is a pretty unique experience. And this is not to say, again, I'm not saying that everything, I'm not like advocating everything Malcolm X would advocate. He has some pretty, the language he uses, I think, is pretty unsettling, or sort of, it's powerful at times, but a very, very different perspective than I have and that I grew up with.
Yeah, and I think anytime you read somebody that, would you call him a polarizing figure? I feel like he has that kind of reputation where even those that don't know very much about him, they know the weight of some of the things that he was a part of, to maybe an ignorant degree, but still knowing the weight that he was a part of some of the movements. Like I knew that he was a part of protests. I knew that he was a part of some of the underground movements of some of these civil rights stuff, but I also knew that he had some political backgrounds and some things that were at times I think Cold War, things, and then, but I don't know a ton about him. So even hearing some of the things where you're like, I'm like, I know his name and I can see that picture in my head of him at the window. But that's about that. But then I also know Denzel Washington, I think, played him in a movie, and so like I have like Denzel Washington popping into my head. I don't.
And honestly, watching Denzel Washington play Malcolm X, I watched it after reading his book, and he kind of nails the presentation. If you watch Denzel Washington playing him, and you watch actually clips of Malcolm X on shows and things like that, it's like he nails all the cadence, the delivery. Fascinating things about. I love the history of it all, and what I think is fascinating is that Malcolm X usually comes up within the context of civil rights, the civil rights movement, and he's usually put forth as like. There are approaches to trying to make change, and it's you're on this spectrum between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr. obviously is known for his nonviolent resistance stuff, peaceful, non-cooperation, boycotting, some of the things that we understand and know he was up to. Advocating and promoting and a part of a huge team of people doing that. But on the other side, you often is put forth Malcolm X as like he was somebody who was saying we need to be violent, those sort of like that sort of thing.
That's how I've heard it.
And I would say that's not totally a fair representation of things, but that's often people will talk about that stuff.
Is that like an oversimplification?
Is he a little bit more Malcolm or is he a little bit more Martin? Okay. That's sometimes that
which I mean,
even
Martin Luther King's movement had elements that leveraged, I would say more intentional opportunities where force was maybe inflicted upon them, whereas I think Malcolm was saying like where if we can take advantage of maybe going after something with a little bit of force to gain things, they weren't opposed to that. Is that more of like where it's not like these very like different things? I think their philosophies were a lot closer. They just had maybe a little different, because I remember Malcolm Gladwell talked about some of the things on Malcolm X, and that was one of the things that he pointed out, where it's like the philosophies weren't as different. And as soon as you said that, it clicked into my mind, where he's like, this is the type of thing that happens. Revisionist history talks a few times about reclaiming some of the civil rights stuff. And
like everybody, I think we all, I know that I'm drawn toward narratives that help simplify things. And sometimes in that course of simplifying, it actually distorts what it is, what's going on. In order to grab a hold of the story and remember it, certain pieces are lost or just kind of not mentioned. If you do that enough, you start to get a misrepresentation of what's going on. And I think Malcolm X is a really interesting figure because he's involved with what's something called the Nation of Islam for a long time. Yeah. With a guy who was named Elijah Muhammad, who was kind of putting himself forward as a prophet. Yeah. And there's a whole sort of religious environment that he was involved with. And part of Malcolm X's trajectory is he had a falling out with Elijah Muhammad over accusations that Elijah Muhammad was sleeping with some of the women who were working for him, had actually had a few kids out of wedlock. Huge thing. And as a result of that, Malcolm X started having his own crisis of faith, went to Mecca to meet to other Muslims in the world, and as part of what's called the Hajj, this pilgrimage there that all Muslims are supposed to do, he came to understand that the version of Islam that he was involved with is not the same thing, or had some pretty stark differences between that and the real thing. And what stood out to me that it was after that Malcolm X started being more open to working with people who looked different than him, who were from a different cultural background or ethnic background. And so this exposure to even a broader view within his own kind of movement and framework changed his relationship and his willingness to work with somebody like Martin Luther King Jr. or other people in the United States. So you have a lot of rhetoric from Malcolm X before that is you can hear it. Well, even if you go back, you can YouTube like clips where he's on shows, and whenever he speaks, he says, "Well, the venerable Elijah Muhammad," and then he'll give his answer. And it's clear that he is not trying to speak on his own behalf. He's saying, "Well, what the prophet would say is, well, what," and what he means. He's always like prefacing what he's saying is, I'm trying to tell you what the Nation of Islam says about this, and like offering a defense for it. I know we're kind of going long on this.
I love it. But the truth of the matter is, and I think what's worth pointing out is that through this book, it sounds like you see that his views, his associations, his methodology, his even way of going about some of the changes that he make has an arc of change in and of itself. And so like if you're listening and you're hearing maybe the first 10 years of his movement versus the last 10 years of the movement, they're not similar in a way that we like to oversimplify who he is as a character. You know,
he has his own arc, and that's worth knowing about.
Yeah, we remove that because it's too hard to explain the differences between where he starts and maybe where the end of kind of his movement goes. Yeah. Which is really, I think that's the powerful thing about autobiographies too. Yeah. It's like reading anything on Abraham Lincoln. It's like reading The Pastor by Eugene Peterson, like where he starts, where he ends. I read All His Grace by Brendan Manning.
I said Brigham Young. That's not him.
That's not it.
Not the different guy.
But you know, that I think is right. Especially when we don't know anything about a person, and all we're getting is this like oversimplified couple sentences about a person that maybe even in our minds has been presented as controversial. And you know, we kind of oversimplify that answer, and in the end, it becomes something that I think we steal or lose the fullness of their story. Well, that sounds powerful. It makes sense why that has an impact.
The one other thing I'll say is that recently there was a movie with somebody who was portraying Malcolm X in, I think it's called One Night in Miami, where it's Malcolm X, Sam Stone, Muhammad Ali, and I forget, he's the football player.
Oh, okay.
O.J. Simpson.
No.
Way late.
No, not that one. But in that, you sort of get a sense of Malcolm X as a person, which is a devoted and loving husband and father. Yeah. A compassionate person, somebody who is working to advance a political cause, willing to speak directly. Yeah. Even in the face of overt racism toward him, while like maintaining his own composure. That I think there are things that I, you know, when I watch him or when I read about him, I'm like, those things are just virtues that would be welcome in any Christian I know.
Absolutely.
You know,
those are
humility, compassion, a willingness to speak clearly.
Fruits of the Spirit.
Yeah.
That's exactly what you're pointing out. There's no law against those.
No.
No matter what your, you know, the root of that is. I 1,000% agree. And no matter what your backing is, you see those, and then we see those admirable. I completely agree.
Okay, Trevor, what's your favorite book in the past 46 months?
If there is
has to be about Malcolm X.
If there is a greater showing of the difference between my brother and I, it is not about. It's about to be. I'm just like, hey, are you ready? 483 days. It's the largest survival story of a single man stranded on a single boat. He survives 483 days alone floating in the Pacific Ocean. And It is insane. True story, mind-blowing. The guy kills fish. He traps birds. He does... I mean, it is one of the... And I read it, and I literally, by the end of it, was like, I would have died on like day 5. Yeah. And it's one of the coolest stories, and it really was more of like this guy. I mean, I could talk about it for a long time. Basically, he did all these survival things that the psychiatrists and psychologists would tell you is the only way you survive these types of places. And he created a community on his boat in make-believe. He would get up every morning and he would go to the store and he would talk to the person that he knew ran the store in home village, and he would order food, and then he would go back to his bunk and he had one bird that he would talk to, and they would have conversations all day. And it was like...
How big was this boat?
It was a 15-foot sailing boat. It was a fishing boat.
I thought it was like a rubber raft. It's like, how'd that stay inflated?
It's the craziest story. They get caught out in a hurricane. I don't want to ruin the whole thing, but they get within 2 miles of the shore and the motor breaks, and then they slowly are pulled further and further out to sea. They literally float from the edge of Mexico almost to New Zealand.
Oh my gosh.
That hurts.
It is. So it's literally like he went,
like South of Africa?
Dude, like, no.
The
so
other side,
the other side of Mexico.
Okay.
So, but there's this place in the Pacific where there's no wind. And the sailors in ancient times they called it like the Glades, or is there some name? He sat in one like 1,500 square foot thing and didn't move for 55 days. I
think there's something like that in Moby Dick. I think
it's just this place that sailors are like, never go there, and he just floats in there and he's just there. Anyway, and so the story itself just has all these characteristics and stuff, and of course, what drives him at the end is, getting to see his family again and to be whatever. But the survival itself has incredibly deep effects into his psychiatry and into his psychology of himself. So when he gets found, it's a story of like. Anyway, I found it to be incredibly fun to read. Amazing what this guy did, and just kind of one of those like things I stumbled upon, and then I was like, wait, what?
Yeah.
And really, really cool. So again, the difference between my brother and I, and why our conversations are normally really cool. I really like it. And we just went all the way through the spectrum, by the way, where like you got this, you got VeggieTales, Malcolm X.
All of these, was yours an autobiography or a biography?
It was a biography written by a guy, because believe it or not, this guy was illiterate and was a homeless person from El Salvador that just worked on fishing boats his whole life.
Wow.
That's a good set of skills,
dude.
To get
so
lost
he
in
literally was like, "This is what he was more at home at sea than he was on shore," and so it wasn't weird for him to be. Anyway, so really cool story. Anyway, I don't want to ruin the book, but it's really, really fun.
I just want to point out that we all picked biographies. Yes. How did that happen?
Dude, I picked it because you were partly because of that.
I would not have picked a biography, but you said 4 to 6 months, and I love it.
Mm-hmm.
It was gonna be one of my 2 or 3, because I didn't know this was also about movies and TV and music.
Well, and that's what I was gonna say. Just to transfer real quick, because I don't want to go. Let's go entertainment, just to lighten it up a little bit. What has been a show or a movie that you had watched in the last like 4 to 6 months, let's say this year, that you're like, you know what, this was actually worth my time.
Yeah,
it might be worth yours. Because I think, if anything, I definitely have taken in more content than it was worth. Like, it's just, I look back and I'm like, I don't know if that was worth it. So maybe you want me to start? Are you ready?
I can start.
Okay, you go ahead if you're ready. Okay. Go ahead, Ryan.
Of course, Phil Vischer podcast, but I just need to to say that for his sake. If he's listening, Phil, if this is you, no. This is a show that I watched originally at age like 13, 14 when it was coming out.
Mm-hmm.
And then I showed my wife this year. And it's a cartoon. I just need to say that.
Oh my gosh, here we go.
She said, I don't watch cartoons. She grew up without cable, never watched, was watching like Chitty Chitty Bang Bang and stuff from the library.
That's me. Oh my gosh.
Anyway, but so I had her watch with me Avatar: The Last Airbender.
It's
a
so good.
Great show.
It's excellent.
Great show. Now, let me preface it by saying this. It is a cartoon. Get over it. The first 6 or so episodes are hit and miss on parts of the episodes. Some of them feel a little kiddie. By season 3, you'll be like, I'm a 30-year-old man, no matter how young I am. Like, this show has raised me up. It's so good. I don't know how to explain it any better. It's just a standard great show of, like, the struggle between good and evil, the struggle between responsibility before you're ready for it, responsibility you feel like you're not fit for but you're called to, and so good.
So let me say this. I am a 36-year-old man, and I watched 3 episodes, and I felt like a kid watching cartoons in my basement, or actually at the time it was in my own bedroom on my phone, and I was like, how did we get here?
You just got to keep going.
But I will keep going. The
first 3 episodes have a little good in
it.
them. They're still pretty kiddie. Mm-hmm. There's one episode within the first 6 or 7. It's the one where they have the 2 groups walking through the desert in that canyon. I don't know.
Yeah, it's not great.
A pretty skippable episode.
I'm not above cartoons. I watched all the Clone Wars. I really like the Clone Wars, but that's just because I'm nerdy on Star Wars. So
yeah,
I would say early on they were like had to do some filler episodes that were only kind of connected to the story.
Yeah,
but once the story episodes become the majority, it's excellent.
Okay.
But all the visuals, the characters are interesting. They're all like in process learning things. I think the society things that they show are really fascinating between urban, rural, different prejudices when it comes to whether or not you can bend water or bend fire. Yeah. There's a lot of history that it's all working with. It's a lot about like power and whether you can make a difference if you had all that power. It's a lot of interesting
I'm excited.
things.
I'll check it out. This is the
show.
second time it's been recommended to me, so
I've watched through it twice, and it's good.
All right.
There is no war in Ba Sing Se. Okay.
There is no war in Ba Sing Se.
Don't you love?
I don't know what it means.
All
All right, Tyler, you got one. What are you thinking about?
Legend of Korra.
The Legend of Korra is really more miss than hit. But when it hits well. But, yes, I've watched it.
I've seen season 1. We're talking about this spin-off show of Avatar. That was, I'll agree with you, more miss than hit. I've only seen season 1. The first half of that season was pretty miss.
Exactly.
Second half was very hit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You guys are nerds beyond belief. I love it so much.
So good.
Whatever. It's everybody's nerdy about something.
Yeah. I'll go down the road with you. I'll go down the road just a minute.
This way.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
You're gonna block your face.
I'm sorry.
From the audio listeners.
Got it.
Yeah.
I would say Loki just had its last episode, and I will not spoil it, but it's like Doctor Who plus Time Heist. It's great. It's a lot of fun. Like all the visuals are, if you've played BioShock or if you've and like if you were a Doctor Who fan, it's got a lot of all over the place, as well as sort of the vintage technology vibe. It's really, really.
I've heard nothing
really,
but
really
good things about it.
So.
For those especially like Marvel, I've heard that it's definitely like a fun kind of like road into deeper things that are going on kind of through the show. But I know nothing. I haven't seen it. So
it's just purely great. Great popcorn watching. That's about it. Which is Marvel at its best does like explore some, in my opinion, explore some interesting things. But this is really it's fun.
It's so good.
It's got enough heart to be, to like carry it for all the entertaining ride.
Dude.
So, which is not what I would say for like Captain America and Winter Soldier. I thought that was Falcon
fine.
and Winter Soldier. It
felt like a boring Bourne Ultimatum.
It was too slow. They didn't have a villain. They didn't. There was a problem.
Yeah.
Anyway,
so you're suggesting Loki?
I recommend Loki.
WandaVision
was good. Loki's great.
I thought WandaVision was incredible, and Loki was great.
I kind of thought the first 4 episodes of WandaVision were amazing, and then the rest were all right. Yeah. That was kind of my thought process, but it was just more of the like nostalgia road of the first 4 or 5 episodes that I was just like, I even got my wife to watch it, and she was like, "This is ridiculous! How much this is making me get in my feels."
Yeah,
you know.
I just love the cosmic side of all those comic stories. So I'm one of the few people who thinks that Thor: The Dark World, Thor 2, is pretty good compared to Thor Ragnarok. Most people are like, I don't even remember Thor: The Dark World, but there's so much mystical, like cosmic level stuff in there. I liked it a lot. So also Doctor Strange.
It's not bad. They just introduced way too much. It was a sort of the learning curve just to get into the story was so it was so steep. Just to get there, you're like, I don't like. Why not just invent another mystical? Like that's what the stakes all felt for me sort of contrived in this way that didn't get earned. Whereas you get to that same level of stuff in Doctor Strange or Infinity War and down the road in Marvel, and you're like, well, of course these stones are doing all this.
But we've been learning about them forever.
Me, it just felt like Chronicles of Riddick somehow got into a Marvel movie, this ridiculous alien race.
Right, make
the second half, the story arc with Loki, the story arc with their mom. Powerful, and you forget about it.
I agree.
All I'm saying is I like the cosmic side. Iron Man's great, but I like Doctor Strange more every time. Yeah, because it's like 17 worlds are colliding in this one moment, and Iron Man's like, I need to shoot more missiles at you than you shoot at me.
Yep.
I'm like, okay, I get it.
Goodness. What else you got?
Yeah. How about space lasers, not just regular lasers?
Space lasers.
Okay.
So a hammer will solve this stuff.
I'm like torn between like 4 or 5 shows and things because I am the type of person that likes to watch really intense TV.
Yeah.
Like I really like extremely intense TV, and so, but I'm also like the super nerd, and so. Like I have 3 or 4 shows in my mind, but the one that I can recommend that I've found, I think, both fun because I think it has some historical stuff that I've been really interested in. Part of it is because I watched Hamilton on Disney, and then it got me into reading Hamilton's autobiography and some of that stuff. But I really like this older series on HBO called John Adams, and it follows John Adams from when we declare independence from Britain, and then trying to make these. I know you're already yawning because it's that boring. I know, but they're trying to make these treaties with France in order to get an alliance so that we can. And it follows George Washington through some of the stuff, and there's these. It's literally a show about people sitting in the room talking about things that you've learned about your whole life and watching them kind of transpire, but then also seeing flesh and weakness and brokenness and like the hardship of some of those times. And what the show has done for me, more than the show being like some spectacular show, is like something happens in the show, and then I go down Wikipedia and YouTube like time tunnels, and I'm like, what are they talking about right now? And so then I go to like oversimplified history, or like I go to some silly YouTube place, and I like learn about what they're talking about, and I'm like, oh, this is a big deal, and like this is what was really going on. And so I've only been like 6 episodes in, or 7 episodes into season 1, but it's one of those where I'm like, you know, George Washington's the first president, John Adams is vice president. They're literally talking about how like George Washington is the only thing keeping the country together, and how like he should never step down as president because the country will literally fall apart because nobody agrees with anybody. And then John Adams becomes president, and France and Britain go to war, and now they're like trying to decide whether or not they're going to back up France. But they don't really it's an incredibly intense thing, and for me it's like it wraps all this history / stuff up, and then it does it in a tasteful way where like I don't have to like fast forward through sexy things that I don't really want to watch, and I don't have to worry about the language around my kids because it's most of the time pretty tasteful, PG, and I really enjoy kind of things that make me think and make me go, what would I do if I was in that scenario, and how would I act if I was in this place? And then John Adams' views go from like direct independence, low government, to we almost need to establish a monarchy to like control the nation. Yeah. And you're like, John, no, you can't. You know, we don't just need
fought
that.
Against us,
exactly.
John.
And so it's just it's a fun thing. He's a terrible dad, and I don't know. It's just been it's been a really, really cool show. And if you're into any of that boring stuff, you might like it. And
I loved it. I watched it probably 4 or 5 years ago or something. And I think the thing that I found most compelling was the relationship between him and his wife, who is clearly a conversation partner. Somebody who he's processing everything with, and it's in a time when women were denied both rights as citizens and position, like authority. All of those things were like strategically denied to them, and so all that's going on. But it's clear that at least as it's portrayed, and I think it's being drawn from like letters between them, it's clear that she is the person with whom he's doing all of this processing and with. He's walking through these things and bouncing off. And it's just the sort of intimacy and tenderness of that friendship. I think it was just,
it's beautiful.
It's really, really kind of moving.
It's really good. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because it's definitely the first 4 episodes. I found myself going like, this reflects the type of marriage that I think would be really, really healthy. And how he definitely calls her into, and her voice into, deep places of influence, especially when he's in difficult situations, and he listens very well and he respects her, and she also respects him and loves him, and they just have in the midst of, like, I would call terrible family dynamics or terrible marriage dynamics at the time, they somehow have grafted and figured out how to have a healthy one. And looking into the history, you're absolutely right. They are modeling this after letters, diaries, and personal accounts of friends that are like, John wouldn't know what to do, and then he'd go home, and then the next day he'd have a great idea. And they're like, wonder how that happened, you know? And it's like, he went home and talked to the brain of the house, and she was like, I think this is what you should do.
That's called patriarchy. That's how it works.
I love it. No, it was, and the show does such a good job of. Anyway, I found it to be one of those shows. I didn't have it highly recommended to me. It wasn't like someone wanted me to see it, but I got into it and I went, how have I not heard about this? Like, this is really, really good. It's not super detail oriented. It's much more overarching, but very fun.
Tyler, you're the only one who has seen both John Adams and Avatar: The Last Airbender. What do you think is a better love relationship? John Adams and his wife, or Sokka and the moon?
Wow, not a question I ever imagined.
These are kind of hard hitting
phrased, even in my most fever dream induced.
The actual question is, what should somebody watch first, Avatar: The Last Airbender or John Adams? You know the right answer.
Why choose?
Exactly.
Just have them both going at the same time.
Stereo.
I think that's going to be one of those, like, what do you want, a cartoon or a really boring, dramatic, political?
And actually, the answer is John Adams, and I can't. Okay. Unfortunately, I'm blanking on her name, which is also just
Mrs.
awful.
Adams.
Frustrating. It is actually. They get to call her Mrs. Adams.
I'm looking it up.
All right, look it up, please. We need to redeem her right now.
Well, the damage is done.
All right, last thing as we're looking up her name so that she can have her place in time with John Adams. Yes. Let's just end with this. If you could tell one book that you've read over your lifetime in a simple way, what would you recommend someone pick up and read? Maybe if they haven't read anything for a little while, they're looking something maybe that's fun to read, or maybe there would be something that could be helpful for growth or new ways to think. Is there something that you would recommend?
I can't go first.
Okay, I'll go first. And it's definitely something that I think having read multiple books over multiple different seasons, I picked up Dallas Willard's book Hearing God, and I am just completely blown away with how I've read multiple Dallas Willard books. He is just a voice that I wish I would have been able to meet in person. He's humble. He asks great questions. I believe his books are stimulating, not just because of the information that he's presenting, but it's the way he presents it, where it's like he asks great questions and then he lets you kind of sit with it, and he kind of walks you through some thoughts, and then he doesn't end in like really like stern, strict,
like dogmatic ways.
Yeah. He ends with like, maybe it's more like this than we think. And like, I really enjoy authors that invite you into the learning, that don't just try to shove it down your throat, and don't just try to engage you in a place to like break you down or to tear something
They
down.
don't just hand you the result of their learning.
No, and he does such a good job of taking you on a journey into his own thoughts and then inviting you to kind of see yourself in his journey.
Yeah.
And the title's like Hearing God, the Revelation of the Real and Risen Savior. It's the worst title in the face of the book, but
his titles need help.
They need help. They're so just like, oh, dude, let somebody just write your title. But I've only read like 5 or 6 of the chapters, and I keep going back and reading a couple of them because I can't stop thinking about it. I literally go back and I'm like, the will of God is more fluid than you think. I'm like, all right, I need to go listen to the title. And it's just really, really good. And, John Ortberg wrote a book a year or two called Soul Keeping about Dallas Willard. And ever since then, I've read Divine Conspiracy. I've read his Spiritual Disciplines and now Hearing God. And everything I've read by him, I've just really enjoyed. So if you can pick up a Dallas Willard book, you will probably not be disappointed. His audiobooks are really well read. All that I've read to or listened to, I find them encouraging and fun.
Yeah.
I'd say a book on prayer that I have found very, very helpful personally is called Prayer in the Night by Tish Warren. She's an Anglican priest who she's writing about praying sort of in a season of suffering or in pain or in response to sort of contemplating the pain of the world. And this book sort of walks through there's a time of day that Anglicans will pray. There's in the Book of Common Prayer, which is their sort of liturgical book of written prayers and kind of psalms, reflections that are in there. There's a time of day called the Compline, and that's like done toward the end of the day. It's like the last. I believe it's the last prayer that you pray. Somebody's gonna,
is it like a reflection or just like?
This would be like a written prayer that you pray toward the end of the day. And so she has one that she used in this place when she was feeling very, very separated from God, very, very sort of wrestling with doubt, feeling like deeply abandoned. And for her, one of the things she says is that these written prayers are helpful for when you don't know what to pray.
Mm-hmm.
And these can be the church saying, like, here are some words that you can pray. When you don't know what to say, here are some words. And the book walks through this prayer sort of line by line or phrase by phrase, and it's her reflecting on both the situation that she went through and how her thoughts on these various phrases have changed over time. And the thing that's standing out to me right now is she talked about thinking through this stuff and thinking through what some of the things she's advocating is not an attempt to explain the world. These aren't ways to explain, but these are postures that we can adopt to endure. And I found that very helpful because in moments when I'm most in pain and in confusion, attempts by people that are coming from a good place, attempts to explain feel not just unhelpful but downright offensive at times.
Yeah, absolutely.
It can feel as though it is it's like invalidating my struggle, or it's sort of a Band-Aid answer to what feels like a gaping wound. And even if there's some truth in what somebody's offering, it doesn't feel that way. But on the other hand, that may not be true at all. They believe to know, like, this is what God is up to. That is a incredible statement to say to someone, like, this is what God is doing, which is like, how do you know that? Like, how could you possibly know that? Even if you have a good guess, this is where kind of what you were saying about Dallas Willard's approach being less sort of directive and sort of final and more of an invitation to, like, or a question of, like, could this be what God is up to? And sometimes just the possibility that God might be doing something is almost too far.
Yep.
But that's way better than kind of being like, well, this is just what God is up to. We know why God did this, which newsflash, you don't.
You
just
yeah.
don't.
Uh-huh.
Like, even if you have an idea or a theory, you don't know.
And most of the time, if you think you know, it's just like the tip of the iceberg of what's actually happening, and you're trying to define that as the whole thing. I completely agree. I would say maybe she pulls this out a little bit, and I haven't read the book, but you and I have talked about it before. Tone and then posture, just two things that I remember you just like when people talk to you and they try to express some of this stuff, normally their posture's off and their tone is off. Yeah. It's just kind of like you're arrogant and you're coming at this like with a pumped out chest rather than with a humble heart. Yeah. And I think there's a part of that's what I was trying to emphasize with Dallas too. Is it just feels very humble and very much so like a friend bringing someone, a Band-Aid rather than trying to like explain away the pain. Just kind of going like, hey, this is what's maybe going on, but I'm not sure. And I don't know how to help, but this might be an attempt.
I remember a Shane Wood sermon that he preached one time that was super fiery, which of course is all of them. But he pretty much preached a sermon where he said, God's truth without God's love is not God's truth. And another way he phrased that in the same thing was, we too often take the sword of truth and sacrifice people on the altar of truth. And all that blood, didn't need to be shed.
Yeah.
That, who are we sacrificing to at that point? It's like, why break the skin on this?
Mm-hmm. Well, and I find most of the time when people are hurting and suffering, it's wanting someone to just be with you and not try to explain everything away, and being consistent enough to just show up and be around them. I have several people in our church that I still can't explain some of the difficult things they've come to, and every time I meet with them, there is a part of me that's tempted to try to figure it out for them and figure out the what God's used it for, or imitate it. And it's just such a shallow perspective. If that's, you're like, I don't know. I don't. It still sucks. I don't know how to say. There's nothing else to say other than hopefully God has better answers than I can see.
Yeah.
So
I wasn't ignoring you in the middle. I was finding that book on Goodreads and saving it so I could find it.
I didn't notice.
Okay, good.
Well, Ryan, what do you got?
I assumed you were fact checking.
Yeah.
That's not what Anglicans do. I
got his day book. Okay, short comment, and I'll say my book.
Yeah.
This is most of the things theologically that I have a problem with other people, where they've landed on something, is when they think, I have the formula for how God works. Mm-hmm. Which one is Calvinism? That might be an episode in the future.
Yep.
Anyway, well, let's move on before we get to anyway,
yep.
I don't even know if it's really Calvinism or just the Calvinists I've interacted with. But usually it's like, yeah, I know how God works. He could be micromanaging with the sovereignty, so he is. Done.
Yeah,
and I'm like, okay.
Well, and that could be almost any denomination.
Slide the sunglasses down.
I'm just like,
deal
my
with
neck.
it.
That whiplash from those two comments just hurt. Anyway, okay. The book I'm going to say that impacted me the most, and I've already said it, so please just suffer through this, is Delighting in the Trinity by Michael Reeves. I can't stop thinking about it. I read it 3 months ago, and I can't stop thinking about it. It's so short. It's 120 pages. If you haven't read it, please read it. But basically, it's just a book trying to reorient us to understand God as Trinity. So in the beginning, the first chapter I thought was going to be unscriptural. Didn't have a great taste in my mouth before I even read it, but I was like, it's called What Was God Doing Before Creation? I was like, we don't have verses on that. But then we kind of do. And he was like, God isn't primarily a creator. Whatever role he's doing, whatever hat he's wearing, you take all those away. What's his character? He isn't primarily creator because he would need us to be who he is. He wouldn't have been creator before he created. And so his point was that God before creation was a father and a son bound together in love by the Holy Spirit. And that is who he is from beginning to end, from before the beginning to eternity. And so redefining things in the middle by that. And in the end, a great quote that I used in my morning devotional for high school camp this year was basically, who you think God is determines what godliness is for you, what a godly life is for you. So if you're a Norseman and you think God is in, this is his own words, oversexed, beer-sloshing war god, then you should go do that, because that's godliness. Parentheses, but please don't. And then, like, if you think God is like a stoic, grumpy judge up in the sky, a bookkeeper just waiting for you to mess up, then yeah, you should be that in your church. You should yell at kids when they're running on the carpet that it cost money 30 years ago to install, and you should like. But if God's not like that, if God's an eternal community of love, then you should be like that. That's the book that, like, yeah,
it's messing with you. And I know you've mentioned it several times, and
I can't stop.
I always love when when a book hits you hard, I think you come back to it.
Yeah.
And you come back to it, and you come back to it. And I know I have several books like that in my life. And obviously this one I think has had a deep impact, and I always love when they're short.
Yeah.
Henry
it's
Newman's
not 700
book,
pages.
Henry Newman's book, The Beloved, is the same way. Short, but it is all about how much God loves you. You are the beloved.
Life of the Beloved. Yeah.
Life of the Beloved. Thank you.
Yeah.
Life of the Beloved. But it's fantastic. And that was one that my dad gave me, and he had outlined all this stuff in it and underlined all this stuff, and I actually physically read the book. So that's how good it was. I actually got through the whole thing.
That's got to be good.
Because I can't read it. Well, we have talked about a ton of stuff. We have traveled through airbending and through Malcolm X.
Through the time.
All the way through.
Before we go.
Oh, yeah. We have to get her name. What's her name?
Abigail Adams.
Abigail Adams. You the real champ. You the real MVP.
May we never forget Abigail Adams.
The real foundation of our country.
That's right. She deserved to be known.
She had direct influence.
That's right.
Yeah.
There's some founding mothers along with the founding fathers.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, I really appreciate you being on the podcast. Thank you so much for letting us have a piece of your wisdom, knowledge, thoughts, and I do highly recommend. What was the book this
Avatar: The Last Airbender.
No,
that's right. Yep.
No, your last book,
Prayer in the Night.
Prayer in the Night. The conversations we've had, your explanation was good, but it goes even further. I really think people would benefit tremendously from that discussion, and it would be good. So, great. Thanks so much if you stuck out this entire time. Appreciate you. Make sure to click the subscribe if you enjoy the content. Click the like button or share it with a friend. We're still collecting Q&A questions, so if you need Q&A, you have any Q&A questions, you can put it in the comments or send an email to Ryan. Yeah. So, again, thanks so much, and have a great and glorious day in the Lord. See you later.
See ya.
Bye.